Welcome, everyone. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Mike Martinez. I'm the Director of the Bachelor of Arts in Criminal Justice Program within the School of Public Affairs. I welcome you today to the panel presentation on victims and agencies that support victims. This is part of our ongoing community engagement series. When I look back in April of 1982 and look at the files the audience, it's certainly a lot longer than any of you, or maybe your parents were not even born at that time. But in 1982, then President Ronald Reagan established a task force on victims of crime. One of the issues that the task force looked at is what is available to victims. And unfortunately, the task force found that victims were pretty much a forgotten part of our society. As such, Congress enacted legislation within which the victims of crime would be recognized. That was part of the Victims of Crime Act of 1984 and the creation of the Crime Victims Fund. Victims now have rights as part of state statutes, constitutions, and also by federal law. Now, the Office of Crime Victims will commemorate National Crime Victims' Rights Week from April 8th through April 14th, 2008. According to the Office of Crime Victims website, the theme for the week will emphasize the importance of inclusion of victim services and address the following two issues: how the crime victim field can better ensure that every crime victim has access to services, and how professionals, organizations, and communities can work together to reach victims. Today we are fortunate to have with us representatives from agencies representing crime victims and victims of crime who will share their experience. Crime victims may show short videos, some with graphic content. While we do not want to cause any anxiety or discomfort, the reality of criminal acts must be recognized. And we caution, if you're uncomfortable watching the videos, just put your head down for a few minutes and listen to the content. The panel today will be moderated by Carrie Schmidt. Carrie is a lecturer within the School of Public Affairs Bachelor of Arts in Criminal Justice Program and is also a leading expert in the field of restorative justice. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Schmidt and all panel members who've given generously of their time in participating in this panel presentation.
Not used to standing still working on a mic. So can you all hear me? Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. I'm thrilled that you guys showed up. How many of you have been victims of a crime yourselves? How many of you have a loved one, a friend, or a family member that's been a victim of a crime? How many of you volunteer with some kind of agency that supports victims? Okay. How many of you want to work in an agency when you graduate that supports victims? Okay, great. Today's presentation is really an opportunity for you to hear about the different experiences that victims have. We have victims represented today. We also have some agencies from around the state and from here in our 4th Judicial District, which is the El Paso County District, to talk about what are the programs and services available to victims. You may not realize it, but there are a lot of support networks for victims pre-conviction. Post-conviction, the support becomes more narrow. And this is oftentimes when victims feel forgotten and they may need some more support. And so we're going to talk about some of the specifics, especially with parole, with incarcerated offenders. We've got a parole board member here. We've got probation. We've got a variety of nonprofits represented as well. I think the question to keep in the back of your mind while you're listening to these folks is, what is it like to be a victim? If you've not been a victim or you've not known someone who has been a victim, the experience is life-altering. It's a traumatic event that doesn't go away. And oftentimes, while the wound may subtly appear to heal over, it's always under the surface. As providers of services to victims, of family members, of friends, oftentimes victims hear comments like, "Can't you get past that?" Or, "Can you get over that?" And I think the important thing to realize is when you've been a victim of a traumatic event, it never goes away. And you never go back to what life was like. You create a new normal for yourself, for those around you. And so as you're listening to the victim experience, we've got a combination of videos and actual victims who are going to talk about their stories. Each is a little bit different. It talks about what that experience was really like for them. The most common questions that victims are always asking is why? Why me? Why my loved one? What could I have done to prevent this from happening? Will it happen again? So if you're ever working with victims, those are always questions in the back of their mind. I'm going to do a shameless plug for my class because I think it's one of the best in the whole university, at least that's what my students tell me. It's a restorative justice class, and right now we're working on creating a pilot program for UCCS. So if that's something that you're interested in maybe participating and learning about restorative practices, because it's a form of social justice. It's a little bit different than the criminal justice situation in that what we're really taking a look at is what harm was caused and how can we repair the harm and how can we reintegrate people back into our community as a result of that harm. So to begin with, I want to share a quick video with you. This was a piece that Monica Chambers, who's head of victim services, and I created for the Department of Corrections. It's an interview with 3 offenders and their surviving family members of their victims' families. This is called a victim-offender dialogue. It's a form of a restorative practice where victims of severe and violent crimes or their surviving family members actually meet with the offender. And that might sound a little strange to some of you, but they're life-altering conversations. They take about 20 hours of pre-conferencing with both victims and offenders, and the actual dialogues often last about 6 hours, uninterrupted. So the Victim Offender Dialogue Program is a relatively new program. It's only been in Colorado about 2 years. There's 32 states now in the country that have Victim Offender Dialogue programs. It's life-changing, but it's for a very small group of victims that choose to have this and offenders that are truly accountable. You can't put an offender with a victim and allow them to be re-victimized. So the screening of this process is really critical. We've got about 30,000 offenders under the supervision of DOC, Department of Corrections right now, and we've only done about a dozen cases. So it's starting to grow, but this is something that I think that will be a new trend if people are wanting to have an opportunity to face their offender and have an opportunity for questions to be answered. What I'd like to do now is to introduce a couple of victims and have them share their story with you, to talk about what was the experience of working within our criminal justice system. Also want to honor the memory of their loved one that died. And so to begin, Sherry, would you mind?
No. Okay, good morning, and thanks for having me today to tell a little bit about my story and my family's journey. I am Sherry Tallman. I have been married to my husband for 33 years. We had 2 sons, Nate and Cameron. We are now blessed with a beautiful daughter-in-law and a granddaughter. 1,523 days ago, life as we knew it changed forever. Our oldest son was murdered. For 51 days, he was missing. His remains were found 51 days later in Wyoming. We were put in a situation we could have never have imagined, a situation so unbelievable it takes our breath away every day. We were very blessed to have the means and the resources early on when Nate disappeared, along with our friends, family, and community and church, to do what we had to do to try to find him. We actually gave the first clue to law enforcement. We were in shock and disbelief and asked ourselves, how does this happen to people like us? Not that we were anything special, but we did not fit the typical profile for something like this to happen. We did not live in an urban environment. We did not live with drugs, alcohol, or domestic violence in our household. We lived in the suburbs. We had a great relationship with Nate. We were involved parents. The fact of the matter is that it didn't really matter. Reality came knocking at our door. All of the hopes and dreams that we had for Nate were gone in an instant. Gone in an instant because of the unspeakable acts of others. Every day we go through the wouldas, the couldas, the shouldas, only to drive us nuts each and every single day. The fact is, we could not have changed what happened, but as a parent, that is your mindset. When something like this happens, you truly feel the darkness. Mentally, physically, emotionally, you freeze. And that is when faith gets you through what you need to get through. We go through the motions of the day with crippling anxiety, sorrow, pain, and suffering. We look forward to each night so that we may find some sense of relief. And most of that doesn't help because Nate is the first thing we think of in the morning and the last thing we think of before we go to bed. For us to go to sleep forever seems to be the most merciful thing we could do for ourselves, than have to live with the reality that we will never see our son again. But we know that is not an option for us, as we have another son who needs us and we must go on for it. No matter the age or the circumstances under which your child leaves this world, the pain is all the same. Each day is an emotional roller coaster. Early on in the investigation of our case, a great relationship was established with various law enforcement agencies and the Boulder County DA's office. We were blessed with very loving, caring, and hardworking men and women. In the beginning of this investigation, all we wanted was for investigators to find our son so we could put him to rest. Then we wanted them to find out the who, what, where, why, and how. They would have to be the voice for me. In the beginning, we did not want to know anything about the investigation. We were broken people. However, someone from law enforcement or the DA's office would check on us daily. They made themselves available day and night, weekends and weekdays. We knew early on there were things that we could not know about the case, and that was okay with us. We just wanted them to build their case and find the murderers of our son. They kept us informed as much as they could. We did not attend any early court proceedings as we were so broken. But after each court proceeding, a loving voice would call us with the happenings of the court proceedings of the day. We always told them we were very appreciative of how much time and effort they put into our case, as we know they were taking time away from their families and their own life to help us. In our case, there were 3 defendants. One pled guilty to robbery and accessory to murder. He got 15 years. And would testify against the other 2 defendants. Unfortunately, he lied on the stand over and over and over. After a lengthy trial and a 2-hour deliberation, the verdict came down, not guilty. Wow, that was a shock. We felt re-victimized all over again. We left the courtroom and went into the witness room and had a good cry with family and friends. Then the prosecutors came in with their heads down. My husband and I said to them, "Pick your heads up. You played the cards you were dealt, and you played them the best way you knew how." The verdict just did not go the way that we felt the evidence did. Sometimes juries are a crapshoot. We do not blame the prosecutors or the investigators for the way the verdict went. They worked their behinds off for months. We have the most respect for all who were involved in our case. And at one time there were 18 agencies involved in our case. Because we are people of faith, we know the murders of our son will eventually meet their justice. So at the end of the day, through unfortunate circumstances, we have been blessed with some pretty awesome people in our lives. and who we now are thankful to call family. On a final note, I'm not sure what part of law enforcement you all will go into, but put your best foot forward and be the voice of victims who cannot speak for themselves. Thank you.
I'm Robert Cordova. I'm a lieutenant with the Federal Bureau of Prisons. I'm a senior lieutenant at the federal complex. I was a police officer. I was a sheriff's deputy in Pueblo County, and I worked for the Colorado Department of Corrections as a sergeant at Centennial Correctional Facility in East County Complex. So I've been around law enforcement probably my whole since I was 18, but I've been with the Federal Bureau of Prisons 15 years, 11 as a senior lieutenant. I'm a WITSEC lieutenant, so I go around the country transporting bad guys to court so they don't get killed in the process. But with that being said, I came to speak about my son. My son was murdered in Pueblo. His name was Isaiah Villapando, and I challenge every one of you guys to look him up, Isaiah Villapando. Look up articles, videos. There's numerous dedications to him. There was a movie dedicated in LA. Mike Martinez was there. We were VIP on the red carpet, but I seen the video that they made, and you know, I've been around the Department of Corrections in the federal system for probably 20 years. And the county jail. I don't have a remorseful thing that I want to meet the person who killed my son. If I'm with them, I guarantee you he won't live. I'm sorry that I act this way, but I'm angry that my son died. How many people are 20 years old here? My son was 20, just like you guys. The day September the 2nd, 2015 will forever be embedded in all of our families' hearts because it angers me and angers me that my son is like all you students. He texted his girlfriend about 3 o'clock and said, I'm going to go downtown. This was in Pueblo, Colorado. I'm going to go downtown and get a bite to eat. No big deal. She said, okay. Then she called Isaiah's mother, Melissa, in a frantic state saying, something's wrong with Isaiah. He hasn't text back, or it's not like him. They were in love, they were going to get married, but they wanted to graduate through college, do the right thing, and then have children. So she called again to Melissa to explain that my son hadn't shown up. Then Melissa calls me after I got out of work in a frantic state saying, they called me and said Isaiah was in ICU and he was in an automobile accident in downtown Pueblo. So I tried to calm her down and I said, I'll go pick you up, we'll go, but we bought that BMW from Colorado Springs here because it's a well-made car, so how fast could he be going downtown, right? 30, 40 miles an hour. So I went and picked her up. Well, I have an app on my iPhone that shows the Pueblo Chieftain. And it says, accident downtown, shots fired. So when the picture came up, it was on my son's BMW. And I knew something was wrong. So I picked up Melissa and we flew to the hospital, Barclay Hospital, and there was many doctors and probably about 5 or 6 police officers there. The doctors came up to us and took us to a room and said, your son was in an accident. And I said, all right, let me see him. And he said, he was shot several times. And he said he was... He said he was gone. So, as a parent that loves his son, I was so angry. I picked up the table and busted a wall and threw another chair and busted part of the wall. the police officers came in and one of them would have touched me, I guarantee I would have knocked him out. But long story short, we went and seen his lifeless body. I never in a million years would I think I'd have to call my parents to get a priest for my son's last rites. So going through that, and I started in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. I'm a special investigative supervisor, so I'm a case agent. I've been through grand jury and trials, homicides, so that's what I do. So I thought, God put me here to assist the police department. So through me assisting the police department, I figured the 2 weekends after that, the idiot that killed my son. Long story short, if you look him up, you'll see mistaken identity. Remember that, mistaken identity. Because Mijo, my son, drove a silver BMW with tinted windows. This idiot was looking for a gang member with that same description. So he was going around Pueblo shooting at silver BMWs. 2 days prior to my son's homicide, he had shot up a silver BMW, ironically, 2 houses away from my dad on the south side. And my dad even seen the vehicle shot up, police officers, everybody was there. My dad even said, man, that looks like Isaiah's car. But who would to think 2 days later he would be killed because of his vehicle? And the only reason why I found this out is everybody here, does everybody have Facebook here? I started looking up, with this girlfriend, I started saying, well, have you heard anything on the streets? And she says, yeah, I heard that this Quintana guy was having a beef with some guy from Dog Patch. They're like Latin-Ace little gang members. But anyway, so I started looking through his Facebook and I seen this guy leaning on a silver BMW with tinted windows. And I said, there's the key. That's why my son, I bet you. So I started looking through his Facebook, and that was the only vehicle that he was leaning against that another person would key on to try to find out what vehicle he's driving. Through the police officer's investigation, ironically, it didn't have an engine. So he was just trying to, I guess, look good for the women or whatever to say he was cruising, but they never had an engine. So this idiot was going around shooting up silver BMWs, but the car never ran. It was just a fake thing. So because of his idiotic, and he's in a wheelchair, because the guy he was trying to shoot shot him and paralyzed him because he was shooting up his grandma's house doing a drive-by. At that time in Pueblo, there was a lot of gang issues that were going on. So because of all of these circumstances, my son was killed just because he was driving a silver BMW downtown, had no idea this was even going to occur, and he was shot multiple times via murder. The trial is something that we wanted. We worked and worked. I spent $4,000 in signs in Pueblo. If you went around Pueblo, you would see signs everywhere. Special Agent Jim Moore with the FBI. I worked with him probably 10 years. He knows me well. He put a request for a $10,000 reward for the FBI. They granted it through DC. So we had that all over. So we had law enforcement, Captain Bravo and Glenn Fillmore with the Pueblo Police Department. I can't thank those guys enough. But long story short, the assistant DA, do we have any assistant DAs here? Okay, good. Because of them, and they think that we didn't have enough evidence, they didn't go to trial and they pled out. So this guy was arrested because he was found with a 9mm Glock with a 30-round magazine, heroin in his car. So they arrested him, put him in the county jail. Then they arrested him for 2 counts of attempted second-degree murder because of the shooting by my father, as I told you, and then 2 counts of first-degree murder on my son. They pled out. Anybody want to take a guess how many years he got? You would think 180, 60, 23 years he got. I have no sympathy for inmates. I respect them, they respect me. I'm not a type of person inside the joint, and if you guys want to talk about that, I'm a recruiter for the feds. And I'll tell you how it is to work inside those walls. Because I could be around 800 inmates on a compound, and they respect me, and I respect them. I don't push the issue what happened to my son, and that took me a long time to not look at an inmate and say, well, what family did you ruin? But long story short, once you get into the system where I work, it's not hard time. And no disrespect, some of you guys maybe have family members that are inside the walls. No disrespect towards that part, but I have no sympathy for somebody, especially the person that killed my son, or anybody that was in that vehicle, because he wasn't driving, he was in a wheelchair. He shot outside, so somebody had to have driven, right? So our statement during the plea bargain, we were allowed to make a victim statement. I told them, everybody in that car I want dead. I want you dead. I'm sorry that I'm this way, but you put yourself in my shoes. My son was a good boy. He was a mariachi player. He did everything you wanted him to do as far as being good and not being bad. And that was our only child. So who knows, after today or any day, when we were in LA, that's one of the things that they were saying, you never know what life's going to bring upon you. And Colorado Springs has many homicides this year, so you guys be careful when you're driving home, whatever you're doing, remember, pay attention to your surroundings. That's the thing that, what if, and she's probably the same way. And I met this lady in Denver, and I want to tell you, because of probably you, Melissa hasn't done anything drastic to her life. And I want to thank you, because before we went to parents of murdered children, Melissa thought she was the only one that felt horrible. But with this lady here and many others that were in the meeting that we had, and I think we have them every month, was just a God bless. But I'm telling you, my anger will never end. And I don't care about the person that's in the joint. I don't care about that person. And, I know people say, well, you're not going to be able to get over it unless you forgive them. I don't forgive them. I'm a strong Catholic, and I know I probably have to go to confession many a times over what I said today, but that's me. I'm a hardcore guy inside the joints. I'm respected. I'm around major gang leaders that run cities. How many for condolences, because they watch TV, so they see what's on the news. I was on the news several times. You think that the staff that I work with gave more condolences than the inmates? How many do you think it was? What do you think it was? Do you think the staff was there for you, or inmates? Believe it or not, it was 50-50. I had high-ranking gang members that came up to the man in Spanish and in English to say they're sorry for what you had to go through. And one of the leaders of the natives, he says, man, it's a shame you have to work in here and have to deal with us, Lieutenant Cordova. And I said, man, that has nothing to do with it. But I respect them. I thank them for what they said about my hijo, but make no mistake about it, it's something that unless you went through it, it's horrible because you're empty inside. I could smile, I could make a joke, but inside, and this young lady probably the same way, we're empty inside. And unless you've been through it, you just don't know. It's a sad thing. I don't know how it'll ever change, but one of the things that a person has told me that lost their children through a murder is you learn to manage your pain. But I have a video, but I don't know if we'll be able to show it about my son. I'm very proud of my son. I'm very thankful that all the people that have honored him throughout the years. But I thank you for the time to speak about my son. but I just look him up, Isaiah Villalpando. I challenge every one of you guys. That's all I have. Thank you very much.
Robert, thank you. I hope that you're getting a flavor that this victim experience is different for everyone. And oftentimes, our criminal justice system focuses on the criminal and not the victim. And so we've got some wonderful panelists today to share with you how they and their agencies support victims. And what I'd like you to do, Mari, if you'd introduce yourself, but then if you guys would talk about not only what your agency does, and I know you have a program that you want to present, but also some of the challenges that you face and some of the things that you would like to do for victims, but for whatever reason you can't. Could you talk about that? Thanks.
My name is Maddie Dennis, and I am the Victim Advocacy Coordinator for Colorado Springs Police Department. And so I've been with the department for now 10 years in the victim advocacy role. And we are, on the police department side, we are first responders. So what that means is that soon after a crime occurs, we're the advocates that go either on scene, hospitals, wherever the victims and their families are, to start to provide support and crisis intervention. It's myself, and we have about 6 full-time staff now, a volunteer coordinator, and about 44 volunteers right now that help us in providing support to crime victims and families. I would say some of the challenges, well, I mean, we'll start with the rewards. Before I started in this field, I was actually in the, I worked with offenders, and I was in mental health. And I didn't quite grasp the whole picture of what crime does to people until I started to work for the police department. And now that I've seen all sides of things, I understand now that any of us are susceptible to anything. Sometimes in the criminal justice system, it's easy to kind of label, this is the offender, this is the victim. And the reality is that we're all human, right? And we're all susceptible and we're all vulnerable to become victimized. And so with that, it's important that for us, that we understand the resiliency that we all have. And so I would say one of the biggest challenges in working is that we stop seeing in the criminal justice field, and for whoever is going into that field, is to really make sure that you put aside the label of the person that's on the police report and see them for who they are. This is someone who was violated. This is someone who has experienced significant loss. And I think at that point is when you can really start helping people. As a victim advocate, our role is to figure out what type of needs people have. And in the criminal justice system, a lot of times those needs are just to provide support, sittings with somebody during an interview with law enforcement, helping them understand what all of this criminal justice language means. And a lot of times, because of the crime, they've now experienced significant psychological, financial impacts. And so with that, we also look to see what kind of funds are there to help people kind of help them through paying whatever needs to be paid now because of the crime. I would say that was probably the biggest challenge, is finding resources for individuals. I forgot your other question, I'm sorry. So I think with us, it's not only finding the resources, but making sure that when people are going through their trauma, helping them understand how to connect through those resources throughout the remainder of, sometimes it's very long term. So even though we might see them at the very beginning of a case and then it goes on to the district attorney's office and then to DOC, we sometimes stay connected with victims for several years to help them through certain situations.
My name is Joy Elder. I am a victim advocate manager at the District Attorney's Office here in Colorado Springs.
We're doing this together.
Yes, my name is Morgan Devendorf. I'm the Victim Compensation and Bail Program Manager. We work through the DA's office, so we do prosecution-based advocacy. So after the case moves from the police department or the sheriff's office to the DA's office, our advocates take the case over and assist victims through the criminal justice court process. My job as a victim compensation manager, this program is specifically designed to help reimburse victims for the physical or mental damage that they have sustained due to this crime. So these are victims of violent VRA crimes. We are wanting to expand this program, and I suppose later when we get more into the presentation, I can go over exactly what the victim compensation program does. And then the bail side of my job is to try and give funding to various victim service agencies. And so I work with a board for both the victim comp and then a separate board for the bail, which is the Victim Assistance and Law Enforcement Board.
Okay, so my job as a victim advocate manager, I have 10 victim advocates that I manage. We handle cases like domestic violence, which oftentimes are misdemeanor type cases. We have 2 special victim advocates who handle only sex assaults, child abuse resulting in serious bodily injury. We have a fast track victim advocate which handles the beginning of the domestic violence cases. And we have a victim advocate that only handles juvenile cases. And then of course our other victim advocates will take anything from domestic violence, which are your misdemeanors, all the way through the spectrum of first-degree murder. When a crime is committed, as Monty told you, and you'll hear from Estelle, the case report is taken, people are talked to from law enforcement, and they create a case. They send that police report to our office, where we have filing attorneys or deputy DAs who will review the case and decide what charges can we prove in trial. Oftentimes, the charges that a person is charged with when they are first arrested might differ from what they're actually brought to charges when we go to court. Our victim advocate's job is to take a victim through the entire judicial process, which, as you have heard from our family members here today, is long, it can be confusing, and oftentimes we don't get the outcome that we expect to get, which is a very difficult pill to swallow. Unfortunately, that's the struggles with our case. We have very good attorneys that work at our office that probably could make a lot more money on the outside, but they choose to prosecute bad guys and women. And through the course of the different types of hearings, our advocates either accompany the victims if they want to go to those hearings, or they will go to those hearings and let the family or the victim know what happened. Explain what the next court date is and what we expect to happen at that next court date. Victims have the right to be to get their input heard at different stages of a case. If the judge is considering bond, that is a time that a victim can address the judge and let their feelings be known about potential bond. If the defense is asking for a continuance, that's a point of time that a victim or a family member of a victim can let the judge know their feelings of a continuance. And of course, at sentencing is when we hear the victim impact. And the judge needs to hear from victims because they can only imagine what they've gone through this whole process. So that's kind of our job, is to put them in contact with victims' compensation, let them know resources as we walk through this process with them.
We do.
So the process, when a crime is committed, it either goes through CSPD or it goes through the sheriff's office, depending if it's city or county, typically. And once that case, and you did a wonderful job, Joy, of explaining.
I have a lot to say.
Well, she's a fountain of information. It's amazing. But would you mind, Estella, talking a little bit about the sheriff's perspective and kind of how that fits together? And then we want to talk about parole, because I think that also impacts kind of the next step. Okay.
Hello everybody, my name is Estelle Takei and I'm a victim advocate with El Paso County Sheriff's Office. I'm relatively new to the office, or the Sheriff's Office here, but I've been in victim services for 5 years, previously in the District Attorney's Office in Milwaukee County. Crimes in our county, there will be deputy sheriffs that respond and take a report. And I can jump in at this time whenever deputies or victims ask for us, for victim advocates, to assist on scene. I am one of 3 staff advocates and my supervisor, who will be dispatched to respond on scene for different sorts of crimes. Also, part of our program also assists with resources and support for unattended deaths and suicides, which are quite high in our county. And so we're there for the family members and to assist loved ones with support and resources. As part of our agency, we also work with Manitou Springs Police Department and Fountain Police Department to assist on scene in the same capacity that I would responding to the Sheriff's Office. I work with we collaborate a lot with the agencies that are up here and the nonprofit organizations in our community to assist with whatever the victim needs.
Did you want to go to your slide?
Sure, absolutely. And so our county encompasses, it's actually one of the biggest counties in the state, and so we offer a lot of area that we have to cover with the number of deputies that we have. The Sheriff's Office also, we have jurisdiction, or we run the jail, the county jail. So we provide victim advocacy for victims who are incarcerated, or also if our deputies become injured, we assist with them wherever they're needed. And so we have a lot less volunteers than CSPD, but I think we have a lot less call-outs. We are going to be increasing our numbers pretty soon. And just for stat purposes, I put up some information about the call-outs that we have. This is 2017. I think the numbers for 2018, the numbers are increasing. The call-outs average per month so far has been higher. But on average in 2017, we responded to about 4 call-outs a month, which is about 1 a week. I don't know, it kind of, the trend, it comes and goes when we get call-outs. Sometimes we get a couple call-outs a week, and sometimes you don't hear. and sometimes deputies, will respond during the normal daytime hours in case there's assistance needed. We offer, we try to coordinate trainings for our volunteers. We really appreciate the volunteer victim advocates that assist us with our cases, because I couldn't be on call 24/7, 7 days a week. That would be exhausting for myself, and I would probably burn out. So our volunteers, they assist us after hours between 5 p.m. and 8 a.m. during the weekdays, and then on weekends they're on call 24/7. And so they do a lot of good work, and we really appreciate our volunteers for everything that they do.
Thank you. So these agencies do have opportunities for you guys to volunteer, if that's something that you are interested in. You can talk with them at the end. Mari, certainly, that would be wonderful. And certainly Estelle, yours as well. And Gwen Stein would be the person that would contact for the 4th Judicial. And she would direct people into yours, right? Okay. So one of the things that happens when an incident occurs and that victim and victim's family is first hit, family's hit with the news, the victim obviously has had the experience, is one of really shock. And they're trying to figure out what's going on, how to make sense of all this, and it's really critical, the contact people at the sheriff's office or the police department, to be trauma sensitive and to be supportive of victims in that role. That doesn't end throughout the court process, through the DA's office. Even once there's a conviction, it never ends for the victim. It's difficult to maneuver the system, and oftentimes victims become almost a piece of evidence, for lack of a better term. It's unfortunate, but oftentimes true. Sometimes I've heard victims, and Sherry, you may be able to, and Robert, you may be able to confirm this, that some of the most difficult time is at sentencing, because you relive it all. And then if someone is convicted, they are eligible for parole about a third way into their sentence. And believe it or not, that's that quickly. And because most offenders only serve about half of their sentence because of something called good time and earned time. And I'm going to let Alondra, do you want to talk about that? Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, so it's an ongoing process. And every time you're notified of an offender movement or a parole opportunity, it brings it all back. And so would you talk about, Alondra, would you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what it's like for the victim in the system, how your role supports the victim, and then we're going to move to Dr. Mathews on the parole board, okay?
Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Alondra Gonzalez. I work with the Department of Corrections, the Division of Adult Parole. I supervise offenders upon their release from DOC. I'd like to first thank the survivors that came presented. I know that's very difficult, and it always tugs at my heart to hear their side of their stories and experiences, especially that with parole. One of our main focuses in the mission is to reintegrate offenders back into society after they've hit parole and hopefully finish their parole sentence and hopefully never do this again to anyone. So one of the major reasons I decided to get so involved with victims is because I really believe that as officers in the supervision level, we have a lot to say. Oftentimes, just speaking with a few survivors that call and express their concerns that their offender, their rapist, the person that murdered their son or family member is now out in the community again. There's a lot of grief and a lot of concern with that. So as supervisors of these offenders, we carry a lot of weight on our end to ensure that we're monitoring their behavior so that they don't ever do this again. And throughout my time with the Department of Corrections with parole, I've experienced offenders that are very remorseful. They want to never do this again. They don't want to go back into the department. They had a horrible day. They had a horrible mistake that cost someone's life or pain or whatever it may be. But then we also meet the offenders that said what they needed to say, got out into the community, and now we're having issues with them. So we have a difficult job, especially with working and interacting with these offenders so closely that we want them to succeed in the community. We always have to remind ourselves, especially as officers, that we have to have a victim-centered approach. For example, if an offender is on parole for vehicular homicide for drinking, we have to monitor those UAs constantly to make sure that they're not drinking again, and the possibility of them to get back into a vehicle and possibly kill someone. So a lot of the times, I worked with the sex offender population for over 2.5 years, and these survivors that came to me and were worried that their perpetrator was now out in the community, that brings a whole new level of grief. I had one survivor reach out to me and was just terrified that her perpetrator was out. So we try to give some comfort, we try to supervise them. We do have tools that we can monitor their behavior with, one of them being ankle monitors, GPS monitors that we have to constantly be checking to make sure that they're not driving by victims' houses. With sex offenders, we even took the precaution of them not even shopping in the same areas that their victims would live in to make sure that there wasn't any accidental contact there at a grocery store. So as officers, we carry a lot of pressure. Now we have to multiply that by 40 or 50 or 60 or even 90 offenders on our caseload. So it's a delicate job. So my best advice for anyone looking into getting to law enforcement or supervision probation is always to have that victim-centered approach, victim-anchored. Always understand, how would this make the victim feel? Because there is victims out there. I had one offender with about 50 victims. I mean, these are 50 people, these are 5 people, one person that their life has completely been changed with this. So taking that approach can really make you empathetic to what they've gone. And we've only heard 2 stories today, and how many did we say there was? 30,000 inmates? 30,000 inmates, where lives have just been completely changed and affected. I'll touch bases on the good times. So monthly, if their behavior is, if they're doing what they need to do, and none of these violations are great enough for us to take good time or earned time. These are 10 days that they're given per month, if I can recall correctly, for good behavior. So that comes off from their parole sentence. So they could have a 5-year tail on parole, stating that they have to do 5 years on parole, but every month they're receiving those days for good behavior. So that's going to come that's going to come down tremendously. So they could initially do about 3-4 years versus the 5 years or even less, depending. And I know that we have early release options, so if they have met those criteria and have done well, they can meet half their sentence, I believe, right now, and we could request the parole board to allow the offender to get off parole and be done. So that in itself could be completely traumatizing and re-victimize survivors to know that these sentences aren't 23 years or they're not 14 years. They're so much less than that. And how do you put a time like that on someone's life? So again, our job is really delicate. We have a very delicate process. We have to be victim anchored. We have to look into what the victim would feel, but we also are trying to reintegrate offenders back into the society so they don't do a crime like this again. So you have to wear a lot of hats while you supervise these offenders. Thankfully, you don't do it all alone. I know with the sex offender unit, we have a lot of checks and balances to ensure that they're doing well. But I mean, again, we have caseloads that are pretty heavy, so it's hard for us to balance everything. Did I touch base on everything? Okay, I'll try to stick around. I do have a mandatory meeting at 1, But if you guys do have any questions, feel free to ask those.
One thing that you may not be familiar with is that offenders have a mandatory release date. And that means that they have to move out of prison at a certain date. And it's calculated by this earned time, by this good time. Most offenders serve roughly half of their sentence, give or take. Colorado is what we call an opt-in state. If you are the victim of an adult offender, you have to opt in after sentencing with Department of Corrections to be notified of transfers, parole, those opportunities. If you don't opt in, Department of Corrections will not notify you as a victim of the movement of the activities of the offender. It's different for juvenile offenders. In Colorado, juvenile offenders are an opt-out. So if you are a victim of a juvenile offender, then you have to actually notify youth corrections so that you will not be notified of the activity of those youth. It's one of the few states in the country that has this opt-in, opt-out mix with juveniles and adults. Oftentimes the states are opt-out. Colorado is unique, and one of the problems is because we're an opt-out state, or an opt-in state, we frequently don't have the opportunity to contact victims about transference of offenders, parole dates, that sort of thing. Victims oftentimes don't update their data. So you might have an address that the Department of Corrections will be sending you mailings to, and it's a defunct address. Think about how many times you've moved in the last 10 years. And some of these sentences obviously are very long. People tend to not change email addresses quite as often, but we still have trouble connecting with victims. So that's one of the challenges in the system. What I'd like to do is introduce you to Dr. Mathews, and he is the newest, aren't you, parole board member. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about what it's like to be on the parole board. What do you see as far as victims coming into the parole board? And what are the challenges as far as your requirements as a parole board member?
Hi, how are you guys doing? I've been on the parole board for about 2 years now. I've worked in the system in various aspects. I was a prison investigator. I ran rehabilitation programs as well. So I came from the system. I'm just now on the parole board. As a parole board member, there's 7 of us. We're all appointed by the governor. I'm just one of 7. As a total board, we conduct about 16,000 hearings per year. It's in the high range of 16,000. That includes release hearings for people trying to get out of prison early, and revocation hearings for people who are misbehaving while they're out of parole, and Alondra is supervising them, filing complaints. And then we do hearings for them to see whether or not they're going to get revoked from parole. So as a parole board, we have to adhere to the Victim Rights Act. It's part of the Colorado Constitution. And there's only certain crimes that, I don't know that anybody said it quite yet, but there's only certain crimes that fall under the VRA. They tend to be the crimes that we think of as violent. Things like murder, criminally negligent homicide, sexual assault, the various crimes that are covered by the many sex statutes in Colorado. But those are the crimes that are covered. And as a parole board, we have to adhere to the VRA as well. And part of the VRA is that victims have a right to be heard and informed about critical stages. And critical stages are defined, but for the parole board, critical stages are pretty narrow. For us, it's an impending hearing that's coming up, so someone has a parole hearing that's going to happen. They're trying to get out of prison early. Victims are notified that that hearing is coming up, and they are permitted to not only attend the hearing, but to make a statement at that hearing and to talk about how that crime has impacted them. They can do it on record, or they can do it off record. It's completely up to them. On record means is they would make the statement and the offender would get to hear it. They might even want to be seen, because we do a lot of these hearings via video conferencing technology now, and having a victim in the room listening to the hearing, they have a choice to be on video or to not be on video. So that's a choice that they can make depending upon their situation. But that critical stage is huge for a parole board member. I do myself probably 60 to 100 hearings per week. That's per week, not in a month. Every week we do that many hearings. And of those hearings, there's going to be a large percentage that involve victims who are participating in those hearings. So these stories that you heard today, this is my daily occurrence. I hear these stories not only every day, but multiple times throughout every day. Some of them are horrific in nature. Some victims don't like to talk about the details, but the vicarious trauma is real. And the re-victimization, unfortunately, of our system's process, especially at the parole board level, is real. Unfortunately, the way we conduct parole hearings, and I'm not sure there's any other way to do it, it includes a piece of really asking the offender, what happened? Why are you in prison? And when you hear those details, it can often re-traumatize individuals who were the victims of those crimes. So it's part of our job as an individual parole board member to soften that blow and to ensure that nothing happens in that hearing that is so traumatizing that it creates further harm or damage to the individuals who are there participating. Often, one of the challenges we face is the system is extremely complicated. You heard Alondra say good time and earned time. Those are two different things. Good time means something completely different than earned time. So one of the things I often find myself struggling with when victims are a part of my hearing is having to orient them to what is really going to happen with the offender that they are dealing with. A 23-year sentence, like we heard the lieutenant talk about, is not really going to be a 23-year sentence in the state of Colorado. Unfortunately, that's a piece of information that often gets missed in kind of the emotional sentencing pieces of the system. A 23-year sentence is probably going to be more like a 16-year sentence. It's often that individuals who have violent offenses spend about 60% of their time in prison before they're eligible for parole or ultimately get out to parole. There are what's called an MRD, or a mandatory release date, where we can no longer hold people in prison. There's this thing called a PED. There's all these acronyms that I have to explain to victims when we're coming through hearings. When people become eligible for parole, and it often comes a lot faster than victims realize. They don't realize that a sentence today could mean in 5 years I'm having to now deal with a yearly parole hearing because their parole eligibility date came so fast. And the way it works in Colorado is if you're denied parole, typically you can only be denied for a year, and then the next year you have a hearing, and then the next year you might have a hearing, and ad infinitum until you ultimately can no longer be held in prison if you're not released early. So victims, I don't know if that just doesn't happen on the front end, but I do spend a lot of my day having these conversations about what is this really going to look like for the next 5 years or 6 years until this individual can no longer be held in prison, and that is often a shock that they were not anticipating coming to their initial parole hearing. So that is a huge challenge that we face as parole board members, because we're the ones now breaking that really bad information to victims who weren't either aware of it or didn't really understand that that was the case when this event happened to them in the system. There's also a lot of things that we have to base our decisions on as parole board members, and it gets very confusing for victims who have certain feelings about cases. Maybe they want offenders released. That it's a rare circumstance, but it does occur. And we can't just do that. We have criteria that we have to base our decisions on that are enshrined in law, and we can't just change the law. The first thing is victim input of the 10 things that we have to use to make decisions. So number 1 is victim input, as it's listed in the law. But there's a bunch of other stuff as well. The risk for reoffense, the criminogenic needs, and I'm sure you guys have heard that. All the things that they need to address that are going to mitigate their risk for reoffending. Substance abuse, antisocial thinking, some of their impulse control issues, those kinds of things. And if they've gone unaddressed, we have to take that into account. How good is their parole plan, their institutional conduct? Do they have any opportunities for gainful employment and a place to live and support in the community? So all of these things get taken into account and could ultimately result in a decision that may not be favorable to the victims of the crime because some of the law guides the way those decisions are made. And again, it's our responsibility to try to soften the blow and explain that to the victims who, again, aren't aware of the intricacies of Colorado statute and all the various things that govern the way we make decisions at the parole board. So those are just some of the challenges that we face on a daily basis when it comes to assisting and facilitating victim participation in our hearings. It's a lot with the caseload size that we're dealing with, having to really not re-traumatize folks that we're seeing, and then the decisions that get made that are often hard to take in certain circumstances.
We have an amazing parole board in Colorado. Sat through many of those hearings, and the compassion, the support that you give, balanced with fairness, I think is really challenging. And he talked about the vicarious trauma. When you're hearing 60, 80, 100 cases a week, it seeps in. It can't help but seep in. And if you ever get an opportunity to go to a parole board hearing, it is a fascinating experience, and these people are really very, very amazing at what they do. 97% of all offenders are going to be out on the street in your lifetime. So when we talk about reintegration and how critical that is, parole board has to follow a mandate. Even if they don't think somebody should be out on the street, if that mandatory release date comes up, they have to put them out. And we do have community corrections, and we have some step-down programs to kind of ease people into the community, but there are cases where there are people let out that probably it would not be their best choice, let me put it that way, to put those folks out on the street. I don't want you to walk away from this experience thinking that there is rehabilitation for all offenders. There isn't. There are people that are truly evil and probably should never get out, but for one reason or another are going to get out. And that's really hard as a victim's family, and as a community member, because there's a lot of fear around that as to what happens in the future. Would you mind talking next a little bit, because I want you to pick up kind of some of the pieces of probation, how that fits in, based on some of the comments that you've heard other people make. Could you fill in the blanks for me? Because you've seen both sides. And then I'm going to talk about domestic violence and some of the services that are available for folks that have had that experience as well. Okay?
Hello, my name is Jason Murphy. I'm the Victim Services Probation Officer here, and I oversee the Victim Notification Program for the Probation Department. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today because, truthfully, this system's a big machine, and oftentimes some of us don't know what the other one does because you have enough to learn on your own. I should start out by saying that oftentimes victims, as well as the public, don't know the difference between probation and parole. So I'll just state it simply. Probation occurs prior to prison usually, and parole occurs after prison. Probation does get cases that are reconsidered. I'll tell you my background because it's a little unique how I got to this position. I've been a probation officer for 20 years. I started out as a juvenile probation officer for 4 years. Then for the following 15 years, I was what's called an intensive supervision officer, which is the highest risk offenders there are. I specialize in gangs. I taught a cognitive skills 20-week course, 10 months out of the year for 14 years. And I basically was immersed in servicing offenders. And we mentioned vicarious trauma and all of that. I had a little girl who was 2 years old. I retired in 5 years, and I had to decide what I have to do to take care of myself. So you're welcome to laugh at me, but I said I'm sure as hell I'm not going to keep doing what I'm doing because it's just messing with my head. I had, unfortunately, the tragedy just happened with the deputy being killed. That's one of my clients. Last year, the 2 children that were murdered in Coronado, one of mine. And it just gets old. So for me, I decided, well, what can I do that's opposite of what I do now? And so we have a position, the Victim Services Officer, and they run the Victim Notification Program. So I decided to do that, which has been very enlightening for me because I come from the complete other side. The thing is, I used to tell people what to do and how to do it. And now I spend most of my days listening and providing empathy, which is extremely difficult, I think, for most people in the world, let alone offenders. You've heard of the VRA today, the Victims' Rights Act. Probation operates under the same principle as parole. It's unfortunate, and I appreciate that you brought this up. The Victims' Rights Act has things that are called qualifying cases, if you will. That's almost insulting to say. But if you're a qualifying VRA case, and there are a number of them, probation will invite you to be a part of our notification program, and you do have to opt into our program. I currently have 627 VNOT cases, and I'm the only person that does it, if you'd like to give me some money. Our program is a notification program. I'm not allowed to be an advocate, even though I would like to be. These fabulous advocates, they do things that you just wouldn't know unless you went and watched them. I'm not allowed to do that. What I play is more of a role of, I try to strike a balance between servicing offenders and servicing victims, which is difficult when someone gets probation. If you can imagine, you've heard some horrific accounts today of people that went through the system and had fabulous support, but the outcome wasn't necessarily just. And in many cases, when people get probation, and we offer them an opportunity to be on our program, you can imagine that they feel like sometimes it's a second shot at justice. So what I have to do is, we have a long list of things that we notify victims of, and they are called critical stages. But they're everything from revocations to transfers to interstate compacts, which is going out of the state, modifying the conditions of probation. So the law just changed. You can't just change someone's probation. You're supposed to ask for input from the victim, have a hearing if that's not possible. I also have to help them go through the process. So I'll just shorten this for you. A probation revocation, you would think in layman's terms, is, hey, you got an opportunity to be on probation and you probably should have never got it, and you screwed that up, so you're going back to court and you're going to prison. That is not what happens. There is a lengthy process. At times there are multiple dates that are set. Revocations can last up to a year or so, and I have to walk people through each process. And if they're in our program, we're supposed to notify them each time something changes, explain to them how it changed, why it went that way. Victims oftentimes, this is just my personal experience since taking this job, it is just so disheartening to, as a probation officer, I've been in court for a case for 2 years, which to you might say, well, how is that possible? It's just set out. It's hard to tell a victim, this is the next court date, and they come and they don't get to speak. Well, there's another court date. They come and they can't speak. I just spoke to a lady today that said, I wanted to speak, but I didn't get a chance to speak, but the next court date's the day after my birthday, so I think I'll skip that one. It's just a shame, but our job, if they opt in, is to notify them and walk them through the process. Once the process takes care of itself, and what I mean by that is, a lot of VNOT cases for us, the notification cases, are sex offender cases and domestic violence cases. You can imagine why. If the process works to where there is a resolution that involves prison or community corrections or even the county jail, they all have notification process. So I'm supposed to inform them of the next man up or the next woman up that they can talk to enroll in their program, because a lot of these victims, they set their calendar based on when someone's getting off, when someone's getting out, and they are ready to move. I also oversee what's called letters of apologies, and as simple as that may sound, any letter of apology that comes through a victim notification case has to come through me. And it's not that I want to be the letter of apology police, but it's got my name on it. And so if you can imagine, I just had somebody give me a letter of apology from an offender that said, hey, in so many words, you were under the impression that I kidnapped your granddaughter. If you would have asked me, I politely told you where she was. I can't say that to somebody. And so I always tell new probation officers, and a lot of people from UCCS volunteer in our unit, if you want to learn the true nature of someone or the lack of empathy they have, ask a probationer how their crime affected the victim. And what you will often hear is the probation client will say, whoa, 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 man. I did the community service, I paid the fee, I've taken all the UAs, I paid my fine. Why are you bringing up old stuff? And it's interesting because they lack empathy. And so part of my job is also to make sure that we don't re-victimize victims. It's not that, I won't speak for the victims on this panel, but it's not that victims are awaiting the letter of apology from an offender because that will do anything for them. But we have to make sure in trying to rehabilitate people and reintegrate them into society that we can show them exactly where they're missing empathy, how they affected someone, so that hopefully they don't do it again. This is why I said I'm glad to be here. Probation obviously struggles to reach victims. And so here's my plea to everybody. The probation process, once everyone goes through the system and trials and things like that, however long they take, let's just say they take a year. Then probation will ask the victim if they want to provide another statement or anything new, because things obviously change over the course of a year. And the information we have is often outdated and limited. And so then we're chasing people and we can't find them. And then, if they get probation, we ask them if they want to be in our program. So I'll give you something staggering. I pulled this number. Last year, the probation department sent out 3,000 invitations to the victim notification program. So it's 3,000 VRA qualifying crimes. 8% of those letters resulted in people enrolling. 8%. So that's the main problem as far as probation. The obstacle I see is that we would love to provide a service to people, and the people that I am able to help, I'll be honest, it's really lifted my spirit. Most victims have more empathy for the person that did something to them than the other way around, and they would like to just be included in the process. They're not shocked that someone gets another opportunity or that they came up hot on their first UA. They want to be included. They want to know if there's a warrant out, should they prepare to move? Do we know if they live in another state, do they have family there? So part of the whole inclusion of having a victim be notified is that they feel like they're part of the process. The rest of it is a big machine that, you know, hopefully will continue to improve. I was going to tell you, this happened to me 2 days ago. Somebody called me. You can imagine my job, I'm the only person that does this, so like somebody gets a call from a victim and they're just not happy. And people go, let me get you over to Jason Murphy, he'll be happy to help you. So I kind of got warned that this person was upset, what have you. So the first thing I asked them was, you know, have you ever heard of the victim notification program? They said, no. I could look it up when we sent the letter, what address we sent it to, so that they know that we attempted to do it. Of course, they said, that's the oldest address on earth. So I proceeded to enroll this person 6 years after the sentence to probation. And this person said to me, I just learned more in 5 minutes from you than I've learned in the last 6 years. But see, I can't even reach who you are. So that's why, you know, a lot of these agencies, the DA's office, the Sheriff's office, they help us tremendously. But to improve the process, in my opinion, that's where it has to go. Here's my plea to some of you young people that want to be involved in law enforcement or working with victims or anything else. The probation department has a volunteer unit, and you've probably heard my coworker here speaking, and it seems like most people want to come have the PO experience, you know, to go to court, to learn about the system and everything else. Well, I work in that same unit. And now our program is so big that we're going to have volunteers start helping with the victims. And I wish I would have had more of a balance of that throughout my career. It would have made me a better officer, a better person. If you want to get kind of a balanced experience, I've brought cards. You can get a hold of me. Mr. Martinez knows how. And I think you would find it very interesting, both sides of the equations of probation trying to service offenders like parole and then reintegrate them, and service victims who have honestly been dropped on their heads in some ways because this person even got the chance to be on probation.
So hopefully you're getting a flavor of how the system works, the agencies involved. I want to turn it back now to a survivor. of domestic violence, because I think it's important to hear the stories. I think it anchors this information. So this is Tara.
Share your story.
Hi, my name is Tara, and I am a survivor of domestic violence. As a survivor who was, the original charge was attempted murder, and it got pled down to second-degree assault. I've dealt with all the agencies here, except for sheriff and the probation, which I will deal with at some point. I have a video that really tells my story, but to make a long story short, my abuser, I was getting a divorce. I have 2 daughters from their father, and just got a divorce, was not looking to date. A friend of mine from high school reached out to me, and I thought, well, it can't hurt to go on a date with him because I already know this guy. He's one of my best friends, so why not? So in June of 2009, we started dating. I was raised in a very loving home. I had no idea. To me, domestic violence and abuse was only physical. I didn't understand there's mental abuse and verbal abuse, so I couldn't see the signs that I was in an abusive relationship until it almost cost me my life. So from June 2009, it went from the honeymoon stage to December of 2009, where he tried to take my life and thought he had succeeded. So I woke up in the hospital, and I realized there were 2 paths I could take, and that would be one of, poor me, why did this happen to me, or one of, how can I help others? So I've dedicated my life to advocacy, to helping others, to educating, to raising awareness. Like Robert said, people say to me all the time, you need to forgive your abuser, not for him, but for yourself. And to me, I had to forgive myself, forgetting myself in the situation where I put my kids around someone who almost lost their mom. He doesn't deserve my apology, or my forgiveness, I should say, in my eyes, because that would be doing myself a disservice, because I don't hold anger so much anymore. But I was more angry at myself and had to forgive myself. And I've had a lot of support through Tessa, which Angie will speak about, through the advocates there. I had an advocate at the police department. I had an advocate through going to the parole board. He went up for his first parole hearing. It happened in 2009. He got a 10-year sentence with 6 years on top of that for being on probation for a very similar domestic violence incident before me. And so 16-year sentence in 2009, and he first went up for parole after 6 years. So every year since then, I've gone to a parole hearing. And it is very re-victimizing, but I do appreciate the parole board and the support they've given, and that they listen. I spoke at every single one of his hearings that I could speak at, because I wanted him to know that this doesn't just affect me and my family and him, it affects his family and his loved ones, so it affects everyone. So I spoke at every single hearing, whether or not he was asked of me. I've spoken at every parole thing that comes up, and I will continue to do that, because I think being involved, I feel fortunate that he got 16 years, because as an advocate, I've seen much less. So I feel fortunate with it. Like I said, I have a video that tells my story. I originally made this video as part of my healing process. Then I used it and showed it at his sentencing, and then now I use it to educate. It was made in 2009-10, so some of the statistics have changed.
So many of you are familiar with Tessa. Some of you have maybe even volunteered with Tessa. We're fortunate enough today to have Angie here. Tessa, if you could talk a little bit about your organization, what you do, how maybe people could volunteer.
Hi everyone, my name is Angie Hackett-Larson. I'm the program director at Tessa, and I first want to thank Tara. Tara sits on our board, and it's so brave of her to always share her story in these settings and her experiences throughout the community, just to bring awareness to it. So thank you, Tara, and to other people that have shared their story as well today. I know it's not easy to do. So I just want to kind of share a little bit about what our services are, and then I'm happy to kind of talk about some volunteer opportunities. So for those of you that are not aware, Tessa is the only agency in El Paso County and Teller County that provides wraparound services specifically to victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. We serve over 10,000 individuals every year, men, women, and children. So while I like us to think that Tara's situation is unique, it's not. I could just share with you briefly that I was in our safe house, which I'll talk about shortly. Just yesterday, and I walked upstairs and saw someone with significant injuries, some of which resemble terror. So this is a very real thing that we deal with every day, and I can also just echo the sentiments that the vicarious trauma is real. So please make sure as you're doing this work, you're going through school, that you're also taking time to just make sure you're taking care of yourself and getting yourself cured and finding people that you're safe with to process these situations, because as you continue to move forward in this work, it's difficult. So please be thinking about that as you move forward in your career. So some of the services that TESA offer, we do have a 32-bed safe house. It's in a confidential location, but that's for individuals who are in an emergent situation that are fleeing domestic violence. They may not have anywhere to go. Maybe the violence happened at home. They don't have other resources, other family, or just not a safe place to go, so they can come and stay at the safe house for an undetermined amount of time. Whatever works best for the individual or the family. While they're there, we again provide wraparound services. So whatever the next step is for that individual. And traditionally, when we have people come in, we just want them to take a respite, like just to center, to be in a safe space, and then allow them to talk about what are they needing. Some people flee with nothing. They literally will come barefoot in their pajamas, potentially in scrubs, no ID, no driver's license, no birth certificate. So we sometimes have to start the process from just the very beginning. So for some people that process might take months. For other people they may have a couple, just need to be there for a couple of weeks until they can transition. But we do have that space. So it's kind of the cornerstone of a unique program that we provide that's singular to TESA. We also have a 24-hour crisis line, so we have somebody available all the time, every day, Monday through Friday, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, to answer calls from people that are in crisis, that need help. Maybe they need to process a situation, maybe they need to find out about a protection order, maybe they just need to find out if they in their words, are they a victim? Just someone to share their experience with that's safe and confidential. That's one thing TESA can offer. We're protected by a statute to be a confidential victim advocate. I should make sure I should have, because that doesn't necessarily apply to everyone up here, but victims can share their story with us, and we can hold that information and not have it move it forward, which is something unique when you have that title as a confidential victim advocate. We also have on-call hospital support. We try to have that the same 24/7, and for the most part we do. But there are times we don't have somebody on call. But we also have, we house at Memorial Maine, so downtown. We have an office there with a full-time advocate. We also have a part-time advocate with part-time hours there. And that's for individuals that are victims of domestic or sexual violence that come into the hospital. They work with a sexual assault nurse examiner's team. They traditionally will call us, and then we will, if someone's not there already, the advocate will deploy someone down there to meet with that person, provide that service, just see what their needs are, and then offer that next step to them. We also have a robust kind of court support team. So we have advocates down at the courthouse every day starting at 7:30 that will help with the temporary protection order process. So if individuals are coming in or seeking a protection order, that paperwork begins at 7:30. It has to be turned in if you're looking for something the same day by 9:30, and then those sessions start at 10:30. So we have advocates that walk them through that process of filling it out. It's very re-traumatizing. People have to reshare their experience over and over and over through this, and the burden of proof lies with them. So they have to be, unfortunately, they have to be willing to share that. So it's nice for them to have someone that can walk through that process with them and help them process that. After the TPO, if they're granted the TPO, we traditionally will have an advocate walk out with them and discuss the next process, which is the permanent protection order hearing. New to TESA over the last year or so has been this project called Project Lift, and that is a legal program where we contract with about 20 attorneys here that will then walk that person through the permanent protection order process. So that's free of charge to them. We receive a grant, so we pay the attorney, but the victim isn't responsible for that. And then they have somebody that can take that case. We've done about 190 of those cases over the last probably 8 months. We're looking to do about up to 360 through this kind of original kind of grant process. So that's something new that's been really helpful, and actually stemmed from a survey that we did with victims about when you need legal support. So that's one thing we're certainly looking at providing. We also have a housing program, so individuals that are needing to, maybe their abuser was the main financial person and has left them in the housing with no rental support. They can come to us and we can provide temporary housing over a certain length of time. It traditionally tends to be a tiered, so maybe we'll pay 100%, for 3 months, then maybe pay 75% until they can get themselves in a space to be able to maintain that, so they're not ending up homeless as well. There's a huge correlation between domestic violence, sexual assault, and homelessness. We're trying to also meet that need as well. So that program also applies to individuals leaving the safe house. If they're at a point where they're able to step into housing, we can help with that transition as well. And that also is something newer and stemmed as well from the survey. You need housing support. So we're listening and certainly trying to provide those services. We also have a really extensive counseling programs. We provide individual counseling and group to men and women and children. Our group numbers this Thursday night, we're at 65, so that's people just coming to do just groups. That doesn't count any of the other services, but that's a huge increase for us over the past few months. We also have walk-in advocacy services, so people can walk in, ask questions. That happens Monday through Thursday from 7:30 to 4:30 and 7:30 to 12 on Friday. So our main office is open for people to come in, get assistance. What kind of documents do they need? Do they need housing support? Do they need to process with someone? What do they do about their pets? Sometimes their pets are left in an unsafe situation, so how do we provide support around that? So just those kind of resources available to assist them. So that's really kind of the main parts of the programming that we offer. We do have volunteers that really kind of step into all those roles. So if you're interested in volunteering, I have some cards up here. There is a training that's required. Our next one is in May. It's about 40-hour training, and that allows you to get that confidential victim advocate title that protects the victim when they're sharing their story, that we don't carry that forward. So if you're interested in that, let me know, or you can take a card that's up here. I'm happy to talk about that, and we'll just see if there's questions at this point.
What I'd like to do is, Morgan wanted to share a couple of things from your program, from your PowerPoint, right?
I think they have questions about the victim comp program.
Do you want to just go for questions? Okay. Before we open it up to questions, I want to give an opportunity for Robert's video about his son, because I think it's important to remember this is about the victims. I'd like to open it up to questions. You guys have heard a lot of stories. You've had an opportunity to see how victim services can intersect with police, with sheriff, with the DA's office, with parole, with probation. You've heard the programs about Tessa. We've heard from some survivors of these horrific situations. Does anyone have any questions that you'd like to ask any of the panelists? Yeah.
Thanks again, guys, for coming in and speaking. I'm graduating this semester. I'm writing a paper on plea bargaining, and I want to ask you guys, as far as victim rights go, we'll start with you. How does that make you feel, knowing that these offenders are getting off a little easier than they should be, taking you 2 weeks? And I guess the second part of that question would be, should we perhaps get rid of the system of
Was that me?
Yeah.
Oh,
And
well,
then-
I wish they could have died and never fell.
What about you, Lieutenant?
Well, particularly for the DA's office, they didn't feel they had enough evidence. So, there's another side to it. But it angers me for my son because, my son never even had a traffic ticket. And he wasn't, partying or doing drugs or anything. He was coming from college. So it angers us to no end that they didn't attempt to at least try to take it to trial. But I understand on the other side is they were afraid they didn't have enough evidence to lose the whole case. So I hate to say it, but I think it's still, there has to be something. So unfortunately, my son didn't get with justice, I don't believe, even inside the joint. That sissy time, I don't care what custody level he's at, I already know how the system works, and until that person's gone, that's when I'll feel a little better.
You know, as victims, people who lose their children, when you lose your grandmother, your grandfather, your cousins, your aunts, and whatnot, older people in your life, you've lost your past. But when you lose your children, you have lost your future. Someone took that future away from you. So I wish they'd just died. Save us all some time.
Any other questions? Yeah. Oh.
I'm Mathews. I just want to, first of all, thank you guys for coming and sharing that. And second of all, I want to know, like, because I want to work with victims in my career field and whatnot, but I just get so emotional listening to all the stories and all the testimonies that you guys have. And so I just would like to know, like, from you guys in the career field, how do you work with victims without getting so emotionally attached to where you almost can't help them because he just is, like, an emotional state as well?
It's a really good question. Anybody want to tackle that one?
I'll start. And then we can do it. Thanks for the question. I first want to say that I'm glad that you have empathy and that you have some feeling there. That's good. I'd be concerned if it was other. As part of the TESSA training, I worked in the for-profit before I came to TESSA. And in the training, I remember they talked a lot about, setting boundaries, what that meant in terms of not getting overly involved with someone or taking on those feelings. And that's why I kind of mentioned at the beginning, talking about self-care. Like, you do have to be self-aware of that. And I try to coach the people that report to me to leave. When they leave, like, you leave for the day, it's done. And it is a practice skilled, because there will be situations that are going to be a little bit more challenging than others, but I would find things ways that you can get the energy out or the anxiety, whatever that is. I have a dog named Rigatoni. And I'll spare you the story of his name, but I spend a lot of time with him, after work, walking him or taking him to the park, whatever that helps me a lot. I spend time with my family. And then I also surround myself with people that will give me a safe space where I can share things. And I get upset, I cry, I get angry, frustrated, all of the things that people experience because of what I see daily. But I just learned healthy ways to kind of manage through that, and just also, ask people to say, I'm really self-aware about my feelings, and then also ask people around me that I trust to say, what's my pulse? Are you feeling something from me? Am I giving out the vibe? So it is a work in practice. I think it's ongoing, something that will just continue.
Well, like it was just said, creating balance of setting up boundaries and then self-care. I take my mind off of things by doing things completely unrelated after work hours. And I'll also share that in victim services, you encounter hard things day in and day out, difficult things, where you really do give yourself and you put yourself in a victim's shoes. So in the same sense, having humor and sharing with coworkers and law enforcement officers, sometimes there's like a twisted humor, which is not related to a personal story. It's more just sharing a moment of lightness, which really helps.
Well, I'll just tell you real quick, because I don't deal with victims as much as the advocates, but first of all, the passion is sex offender officers. So, like having dinner with us, to her point would be like, y'all messing up. Why is any of this remotely? Yeah, I think you have to keep it in perspective, and I would just offer you that anyone that would trust you with ongoing difficult situations in their life mean that. And I don't think they'll handle that the wrong way. So kudos for you for being passionate enough to recognize that.
Just with the sheer number of cases that we hear as parole board members, role clarity is extremely important. What is your role in what you're doing? Is it your role to get completely immersed in that case, or is it your role to help someone navigate a process or a machine of a system? And that's really how we get through. I have a colleague who is very attached to the cases, and it impacts her a lot. And we often have to talk through what is our role and what is realistic to accomplish in the short amount of time we have with folks. So you really have to find that and stick to it, or you'll find yourself burnt out and not wanting to be in the field anymore.
So as we go through our different cases, and I said earlier, different kinds of cases, from sex assaults to a murder of a loved one to a domestic violence case, every case has its own challenges. My, I guess, way I look at things is most of these people have never gone through the judicial process. And I think that trying to be the best at my job as I can be, to try to foresee their questions, and just try to put myself in their shoes as far as what would I be wondering about. A victim, for example, that can't come to every court date, I have told them of the court date, so I would be wondering probably sometime that afternoon, wonder what happened today. So for me to call them as quickly as I can with just the information of what was said and what happened and what the next step is I think very valuable to them.
So with our role with being first responders, you're in it. You are there moments after something happens. You're there during death notifications. You have to really, for anybody who is interested in doing any of this type of work, you have to take care of yourself. And I'm a very big proponent of mental health. I absolutely am. Trauma is definitive in our lives, and it changes the way we look at life. Vicarious trauma is a very real thing, and so is direct trauma. And so we have to take a look at ourselves, of the life that we've led. We have to understand, like the rules are very important, but you have to understand why you're being into this field. Because this is, as far as we can advocacy, we're here to help, and it's really important to be able to compartmentalize. And yes, we're all human, and you're going to have these horrible times. I've had these horrible times where I have been with parents who just lost babies, and it's hard to sit there in a very unemotional way. But I have to remind myself that this is not about me. It's not about my emotions right now. It's about providing as much support to this person as I possibly can. And then when my work is done, I need to process things, and I know where I need to go so that I don't run out of fuel.
Any other questions? I could probably just speak to them. Great. So for those of you that you find it more difficult if you have children or you are a parent, do you ever find it more difficult finding yourself trying to find that balance, but also trusting in your spouse with the type of things you have to deal with on a daily basis? Like, do you ever find that your parenting more difficult? My dad's a very strict company when he worked in this kind of stuff. So I had a very strict upbringing, and I feel like it's because of the field of work that my dad was in at the time. Do you ever find yourself in that kind of situation of curfews and that kind of stuff?
also have a 24-year-old son. He just acted like I just said. He would bring his friends around me as much. He wouldn't want people to come over so I could retaliate. And my wife would say that daycare probably doesn't like me. How do you make up with that? But, you know, I also would sit in that to I don't think those are negative things that I'm parenting-wise. There are things that I would have done. I'm fondest on path. Yeah, it's messed with me a lot because of what I did.
I have little ones, and I hear some of the most egregious stories. I mean, I do hearings where weeks it's just sexual offense after sexual offense after sexual offense after sexual offense. So there's a lot of things that my kids don't do that other kids probably do, because I've, over the years, become extremely cautious about who my kids come into contact with just because of the stories I hear. So I'm a lot more cautious, I guess. I'm not as, I used to be an investigator, that's kind of out of me these days. But it will impact the way you view the world. And unfortunately, the way you view the world impacts the way you behave, and that's usually where it comes out with your children.
Anyone else?
First off, I want to say thank you so much. Your story, and thank you for telling your story, losing your children. I can relate to DV. I'm a survivor of severe felony assault. Everybody here I've worked with, other than Parole and Sheriff's Office, CSPD is probably one of the reasons why I'm still alive. I can relate to you, to the two that lost your children. I do believe our justice system is slightly flawed when it comes to victims, and sometimes even, I think at first, victims can come off irrational, erratic, and you are everywhere. You don't know up from down. And it's been the advocates that absolutely helped me and my children immensely. So thank you so much. Unfortunately, I can relate though. After the first two DAs quit the DA's office and dropped, we're no longer on my case. By the time my third DA was assigned, I got an email from the CSPD officer that said that he had spoke to the third DA and said, "Why did you dismiss my case?" And it was because it was, he had quoted that he said there was too much to do and too little time for trial, so mine was dismissed. It's very hard to cope with the injustice. You have a sense of injustice. And so that's why I'm in law school, pursuing law school, because I plan on being a voice. I think having gone through it, it's a lot easier to relate. Sometimes you come across people that haven't been through it, so they don't know how to relate to you. So I just want to say thank you so much to all of you. I love seeing the empathy you have for victims, because there's a lot out there that don't. But thank you, and God bless all three of you. God bless you and what you know. So thank you for what you're doing.
Did you have a question?
Yes, ma'am. This is sensitive. I am going to be a police officer, and within a year, this is directed towards victims. What would you like to see from your law enforcement in terms of future and handling future tragic incidents like this?
So one of the things that our department is very focused on right now is being trauma informed. And so one of the things that our department is doing is being more trauma informed. And so what that means is that a lot of our officers are going through in-service training on how to approach their interviews in a trauma-informed way. And so what that means basically is really understanding the dynamics of trauma the neurobiology of how people react during traumatic situations and how that impacts investigations. So for instance, there's times where as a victim, people might experience high levels of force to survive throughout their traumatic event. And then when law enforcement comes in to interview them, they still have those high levels of force. And that impacts their behavior and how they provide statements. A lot of times, the way they process memories is very important because it's not how we typically will process memories in a normal way. When you're going through trauma, it's very scattered. And so sometimes when victims provide statements, they might seem evasive, they might seem that, they're trying to hide something, and they're not. It's just that they're trying to, because our brains kind of store memories in different ways. And so right now our department is very focused on how do we keep crime victims engaged? And number one is coming from a very non-judgmental, unbiased way when working with victims, understanding the trauma that they are experiencing, and allowing them to have the time to talk about their story, and trying not to rush through on that time. So I truly believe that when you come across for victims, sometimes for them, the way they can begin to start to heal is to be able to talk to someone with compassion, with understanding from where they're coming from, because a lot of times they are blaming themselves so much. And so as a future law enforcement officer, that's something to really keep in mind, is understanding where people are coming from when you are gathering their statements. So.
I just want to say that domestic violence is way more common than most people think, and it's probably something so you'll run into a lot. And I think anyone who is in the domestic violence field will agree that we need more education because, for example, in my situation with my abuser, we had gotten into an argument, and I had put my hands across the doorway because I'm a talker, I like to talk things out, and he picked up the phone to call the police. Put my hands down. The police came. I didn't know in Colorado that it was a state law that if it was called on domestic violence, then someone had to be taken in. This is the only time he did something in front of my kids. And so my kids were there for the sleepover, and the police came, and he said, I don't want to press charges. There was no physical abuse, no emotional, no mental, nothing was said. And they took me in for false imprisonment. And he was a foot taller than me and 100 pounds heavier than me. And his reasoning for calling the police was because he knew how wrong it was to lay his hands on a woman. And then when I went to court for that, I was in a wheelchair because of him trying to kill me. So on that, I think that there needs to be so much education around and understanding, because we see a lot of times the victims of domestic violence being taken in because they are erratic and they are emotional and they are a mess. And the abusers are known to be very good manipulators, so they're calm and they're talking to the police officer and they're buddies and everything's fine, and all of a sudden she looks crazy and he looks completely composed. So I would say I really think there needs to be more education, but just to really keep an open mind with the situation and really look at the situation, because I feel like in my case and there's a lot more talk about domestic violence now, but had they really looked at the situation, they probably could have recognized that it was a law.
I could add to that too. As a police officer, you're going to have a lot of calls. So that may mean you might have 20 calls that you're backlogged and you have to get to a certain location. You might have a domestic dispute. Don't cut corners. Take your time. Even though you have to backlog and somebody has to take your beat on your calls while you're trying to take care of this, would you be okay if you just let this go or arrest the wrong person and a week later, or you didn't arrest anybody and you went to the other calls to clear them, and she gets, that upsets me to no end. And just so you know, in the prison setting, someone like that, they're called tree jumpers. Them guys will be dealt with. Not through us, of course, we're officers, but through their own people. So always remember that. Sex offenders are even worse. as officers, we cannot stand people that touch women or hurt poor little kids. So just so you know, their whole life they'll be run. They'll be locked up in segregation because they can't walk main line yards. So just so you know, hopefully that makes you feel a little bit better. But what I'm saying as a police officer, take your time, don't take shortcuts, and in time, you'll understand that's something that needs to be investigated. Do a thorough job, because if you let it go, look at what could happen. Not that that was the instance, but that could happen to you. So take your job serious and know when to investigate and when not to.
I think we're gonna, last question, okay? We need to wrap up.
Okay, first of all, thank you all for being here, and Lieutenant, I hope this question is not too personal or hard to answer, but you mentioned how you still have all these feelings of anger and resentment towards your son's offender. And my question is, how do you stop and not let these feelings of anger interfere with your job currently, especially with dealing with inmates who resemble or have similar circumstances to your son's offender?
It is difficult. I took probably a year and maybe 3 months off, but it was, I had built up sick leave. So the Bureau of Prisons, they know circumstances like that and they respect it, so they give you your time off. But no psychiatrist or no psychologist is going to tell me what to do and what not to do in the field that I'm in. But I'm a very strong Catholic. I'm very proud of my religion. And through my religion and just being the type of person I was to begin with, I knew I can't blame, like if you guys are all inmates, I can't blame you guys, and I knew that. And one thing that inmates, when I returned to the institution, I have a high custody level, where it's a class 4 or 5 custody, where those are the hardest criminals you can be around. Those inmates were, the ones that didn't know were thankful that I came back, because they said, man, Cordova, I'm glad you're back. These guys don't know what the F they're doing and this and that. They cuss a lot in there, just saying. But my point is, I've always carried myself with respect, even before my son, and I'll talk to him like I'm talking to you. They're human beings just like everyone else. But that one, he better never be in front of me, because I have hatred towards anybody that dealt with my son. But I don't blame anyone else for that. And I always treat people with respect, inside and outside the walls. I tell my officers when I train them, don't be somebody, don't try to be something that you're not. If you're a fun-loving guy and you like to mess around and joke, be that personality. Don't step over the line, but don't try to change up who you are. And I've always been that way, and my parents have raised me that way, so I know what's right and what's wrong.